Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a brand new video series. I call it Vivisection, to complement my dissection series. And to be quite honest, I have no idea what I'm going to cover in total, but for now, consider it a series where I look into one aspect of media and discuss it with you, my humble viewers. Now, in my infinite wisdom, for my first entry into this series, I chose a subject that doesn't really have a clear name, or a clear defining thing, in the way that graphics and story do. So seeing the title, you probably have an idea what this is going to be about, but it has several names. Some refer to it as hand-holding or direction. Mark Brown called it the invisible tutorial in relation to Half-Life 2. As an umbrella term, I am calling it guidance, and it's essentially referring to that line that developers have to straddle where they want you to do particular things and get to particular places, but they want you to feel as though you did it via choice and freedom, rather than you were told to go there or told how to do it or even forced. This shit is imperative in video games. Getting lost is horrible, getting spoon-fed is also horrible. These are the two extremes, as we're all very aware, so when is it done right, and why? When is it done wrong, and why? What should games do? This subject is heavily complicated, and honestly, I don't think that many people care, but seeing a bunch of videos that either box the subject unfairly, or barely skim any kind of discussion on it that reference about 5 games in total is tiring. The reason this video is being made is Mark Brown's problematic Half-Life 2's invisible tutorial video. I was recommended to check out his content by a friend, and I have been more and more disappointed as I progress. He implies heavily that Half-Life 2 is the gold standard of guidance in video games. It gives people freedom while teaching them, etc. Considering that this subject is relevant to every game ever, and it is highly important in general, I have decided to submit my rather dedicated audience members to my vivisection of this subject, and see what we can learn by delving into it as far as my access to the internet and gaming libraries will allow. So let's begin. Alright, let's start at the beginning. Why do we even have tutorials? Pretty simple. Video games are a thing that isn't straightforward. We don't need someone to explain how to read or how to stare at a screen. I mean, we could run some lessons on how to actually pay attention to movies, but that's besides the point. Video games are a whole set of new things. First of all, getting comfortable with the controls you have, be it mouse, keyboard, guitar, joypad, etc. Knowing where each of the operations are and what they are called so you can follow instructions efficiently, or at the very least avoid having to look at your peripherals, would be the goal here. Next up is then telling the player in one way or another the specifics of your game and how to apply the peripheral you are using. This could be assuming you know nothing or assuming you don't know the absolute specifics of the game itself. Once this process is completed, the player should very hopefully have enough of an understanding to complete the rest of the game while of course being tested. This is in the interest of being fair to the player. There are, however, video games that will not tell you about several key details to encourage you to explore and understand these things for yourself. However, if you accuse the tutorial of being ineffective of its information provided, as many could apply to Dark Souls, then it would be irrespective of the intentions of the game itself. Therefore, a tutorial is meant to provide the player with the information that the developer wants them to have. So how can we pretend to even come close to understanding what it is a developer wanted us to know game by game when strictly looking at their tutorial section? And that's when there even is a section for it. Many games teach new mechanics as far as 3/4 into the game. So unless we have some strong evidence from statements made by developers or you're a friend of theirs, it would be a stretch to assume you knew they did a bad job. Saying that, I think sometimes it isn't exactly hard to spot when a tutorial isn't fun, or whether it is clear of what the intention is, and whether or not it is clear in terms of the effort that a developer put in. And sometimes the effort that a developer put in can be very clear, even if it runs as intended. So these are a couple of things that players can feel. When there's an overflow of information and you don't retain any of it, players can feel very lost and very beaten down. When you are told something basic but cannot progress in the levels because you aren't told something complex, it makes players feel manipulated. When you don't get a tutorial and you don't know what is happening, players feel absolutely as if they have missed something. These things will often happen whether or not a developer intends it. These things can happen as a result of a tutorial that was tailor-made to be informative, but arguably more important, tutorials can genuinely be terrible. So, when do we have tutorials? Well, most developers like to open their games with a tutorial, a section set aside to have a character or a set of tooltips inform you of how to perform throughout the game. Many games would have this section be skippable or even separately available from the main menu. Then there is a selection of games that invest a lot of design time in combining the aspects of the tutorial within the game itself. that teach you how to play it subtly and in pieces throughout the game. The one thing that is for sure, they do not have tutorials at the end of a video game. I mean, unless under certain circumstances or maybe just a poorly designed game, but hey. The point is the player is told what the developers think they need to know before they need to know it. But who provides the tutorial? I guess the general answer to this is the developers, but more specifically it would be the specific source in the game. This can have a huge range. Oftentimes it can be a friendly character that tells your character in the game how to do something as a benefit. You then see and understand this conversation and move on. Sometimes it's the same scenario, only the information is provided by a signpost or what we call a tooltip. Something that can appear on screen and give you the information directly in-game or before. To go the other direction, you can have information presented via messages that are easy to miss, on walls or provided by audio that can be ignored or missed. Finally, you can have the environment provided, which is another way of saying nothing provides it at all, other than your own intuition. So, what is usually in the tutorial? Well, as silly as that question may be, the simple answer is guidance on how to play the game, but more specifically it is, press something to have something happen, and or do something to complete this mission, with some form of a test to make sure you understand these things. There are about 1 million choices for developers to make throughout this whole process, and one important one here is about how much of the game should be explained. For example, do you tell players how to do a basic attack? Sure. Do you tell players how to do a combined basic attack with another attack? Yeah, sure. Do you tell players which move would be best to use against which enemies? Well, how much should we tell them? Becomes the question. We need to make sure there is space for the player to make decisions. If you have a player enter an arena and tell them that they should press X after A on every move, on every enemy until they spawn a new enemy, then they tell you to press K then L, this would be boring. It's like playing to a script. So you could opt to have nothing explained and then players will discover it on their own, as well as attribute their confusion to bad game design. So you have to be careful. Where does it take place? Most of the time developers will have a particular area sectioned off for safety, and because there is a chance that you may want to use infinite resources. Usually you cannot escape this place until you've satisfied the requirements, like performing a bunch of basic moves and then maybe some advanced ones. Once you can prove that you have the basic knowledge, most of the time the developers will set you free. The other method for this is sprinkling it throughout the game itself, like giving a minor version of a tutorial for one particular action several times during the game, and these places will often behave a little differently than the rest of the game. Once again, having safety precautions and more resources. So knowing all of that, it basically runs through the majority of every form of tutorial in video games ever. Next would be the quality of these things. How exactly are these tutorials meant to be made in each of their respective contexts? Many people believe in this principle to a fault, almost as if it's a litmus test of whether you've created a good tutorial. The way it works is introducing the mechanic in a safe environment, then in an environment that you can be punished within, and finally combining it with other things you have learned within the game before it is essentially considered taught to the player. This applies to practically every Nintendo game as well as many others, giving you a series of opportunities to test your abilities well before you could reasonably be blamed for missing them. It's a nice theory and a nice principle, but it's horseshit. Many games do just fine without this. Oh, and no, I have no idea where the principle originated, but plenty of people are claiming it to be this gospel that describes video game tutorials to a T, and I assume you guys like my opinions to a point where you don't care if I base them on a video game scholar. I prefer some obvious lessons from reality. How about we look at a game that doesn't really use it whatsoever? Dark Souls is critically acclaimed, certainly at this point, so there's not much competition in the "this game is awesome" category. Therefore, we can really delve into whether or not the game has a tutorial reflecting the principle. Dark Souls pits you against a harmless enemy, then it pits you against an active enemy, and then a group of enemies, and finally a boss, before releasing you to the full game. Is that enough to count as the isolation principle? Perhaps, but I don't think so. Sounds to me like a ramping of difficulty you'll experience in literally every game. But what do I know? I guess the argument would simply move to the rest of the game. Dark Souls is extremely unforgiving and lacking in any kind of traditional tutorial beyond the time you spend in the Undead Asylum, which is very short and literally just gives you basic moves. Let's try something else. The Stanley Parable? A game that doesn't require anything of the player other than movement, and hitting one button doesn't have any kind of tutorial, and naturally that means it doesn't subscribe to the isolation principle. Something else? Let's look at The Binding of Isaac. This game literally tells you how to move and how to shoot, then releases you onto the world immediately with a slow rise in difficulty. Does the tutorial aspect not apply here because of the genre? Interesting. I guess this video game principle simply doesn't apply as a principle to video games at all. The truth is, it's just one of many ways to teach players how to perform in video games. So if there isn't an easy way to define how to make a tutorial or how to guide your player through a game, let's check out the absolutely thorough and complicated context involved. So something you really have to consider when looking at guidance in video games is its bloody genre. Do you think that a tutorial in Mario 64 is going to be the same as Civilization 6? How about Super Meat Boy and Darkest Dungeon? Basically, the answer is a strong no. So how do we understand what games need what tutorials? Well, let's look at individual games and get a bit more specific. I'm going to start with Dead Space. I'm a rather large fan of this game and I would like to share some ideas about it. First thing people need to learn is how to look. Since we're getting a very cinematic introduction to gameplay and every action is temporarily disabled, you can make massive use of looking around. Now, the game introduces an AI system in your user interface that binds a form of tooltipping with the narrative. It's a form of futuristic computer display that one would possibly expect for an engineer, and it lets you know about resources and important communications. So next up is movement. The AI gives us a tooltip about walking, running, and looking to make sure you caught that information. Next up is a brief explanation of what door colors mean and how to open them. Finally, a brief explanation of how your locator works and how to open your map or objective screen. The game gives you time and space to be able to acclimate to these basic functions and then allows you to interact with the console. Once you're feeling relatively familiar with movement, looking, interaction, and the user interface, the game says run, entering you into a chase sequence that you have no way of fighting. You must run. This sequence tells us not only that you can successfully outrun enemies, but the enemies themselves can indeed be killed. Once you move through into the next room, you can find a weapon on the table. Your AI gives you a tooltip with a brief explanation on how to aim, shoot, and perform with the alternate fire. Following that, you get a brief introduction on melee attacks, and you can practice on the objects in the room. Also to note, there's a bloody message on the wall that reads, "Cut off the limbs." Moving forward, you're provided your first enemy, and as long as you shoot it in general, you'll be safe, but some may go for the limbs as opposed to the head. Following that, you get a brief description of how your health bar functions and what certain colors mean. We are then provided our familiar faces in the game once again, forwarding the plot and giving the player purpose while providing a chance to save their game. Soon after, you're given the introduction to enemies that play dead. If you manage to kill the first and second enemy, then the game provides you with a clue on killing them. Your allies have discovered that removing the limbs from the enemies subdues them faster than other tactics, and therefore they let you know with the keyword dismemberment. Now, if you were unaware, a big part of Dead Space's marketing campaign was that of dismemberment, and they released the dismemberment demo. Dead Space was considered a zombies in space game with a dramatic focus away from shoot them in the head as it's classically known. I remember the Xbox 360 days and how well this was telegraphed. The big focus was on the removal of limbs. It was now dismemberment, which sounds cool, but a lot of people don't actually to this day know what that means. So, as we can see translated through to the game, Hammond informs our protagonist in a narratively binding way, and the AI on the interface defines and explains the effective nature of using this strategy. So, next up, the player is given a stasis module with a brief control set of how to aim and shoot, as well as what stasis packs look like. In addition, the player is provided an infinite source of stasis resources and a door that opens and closes too quickly for a person to do anything about it. This is a classic way of informing the player of what to do with the environment. This design philosophy of ensuring the player understands the rules and resources regardless of their intelligence is carried throughout all of the Dead Space games, and it's something Visceral know how to do very effectively. Let's check out something else. The Beginner's Guide. You begin with the narrator telling you you can walk around, and that's what you do to receive the story. A story that spreads with patterns and motifs as you go. The game literally doesn't have a tutorial, but has interesting rail-like concepts that are all relating to commentary about philosophy, psychology, and design in general. This is clearly a genre that cannot be held to the same perspective as Dead Space, or several other video games. So let's move on. Cluster Truck. The moment you flash through the menu to the opening level, you are faced with a set of instructions. WASD allows you to move, mouse allows you to look around, space allows you to jump, shift allows you to sprint. Go. This is the developer literally saying, no tutorial bullshit, no waiting, just get stuck in and have fun. How about Call of Duty 4? The game begins with you approaching the entire area as a new member of the SAS, and you receive a tooltip alongside every single tip from your instructor. Once you've been taught basic movement with aim and a brief look into your weaponry, you are tested in an environment that will determine a recommendation for difficulty based on your performance. This brings a sense of competitive nature and a possibility of sharing it with your friends while teaching players how to effectively aim and manage other weapons. So how about something specific about BioShock? There is a really solid introduction to mechanics in BioShock that is in fact similar to Dead Space. You get a gradual introduction to each part of your arsenal, however, BioShock will not give you a tutorial for a new plasmid until you purchase it. This applies to different tonics as well. For plasmids, you'll receive a short video, and for tonics, it's a tooltip. What about Mount Your Friends? A game that is primarily meant for multiplayer, however there is an option to jump into a single-player mode to practice if you so wish. This is in anticipation of what players will be doing when approaching this game. What about Civilization 5? The tutorial in Civilization 5 is extensive, telling the player in as much of a concise way as possible what to expect from the game and how to manage it. There's a huge set of rules and aspects to learn, so the game introduces them piece by piece and with great detail to allow you to reach a similar, if not the same, level of information as any of the lower difficulty bots. So I don't know if you notice what I'm doing here, but we just passed through a bunch of tutorial methods that are completely different from each other based on certain specifics, certain variables. Those being genre, marketing, developer values, game world, timing, player desires, and information density. This isn't even all variables, there are a ton more. So what was the point of all this? Well, I guess my point is that guidance in video games is a wonderful, complicated, and diverse beast with many different interests and goals. Whether a game does it well or does it poorly is totally down to the game itself and the context that comes with it. If you see me dissecting or critiquing a video game on this channel, this is the sort of metric I use. So is that the end of my video? Oh no, there's going to be a reason I look into these things, a reason I make these videos, and most of the time it'll be another YouTuber who has pigeonholed this subject while presenting it in a way that feels as though it should be expected as a fact. So let's dig into other people's opinions on this subject. The best example of this is Mark Brown's Half-Life 2's Invisible tutorial, Game Maker's Toolkit, which is about as pretentious as you can get for YouTube, but let's see what he has to say.
Let's say you're making a game where the player can chop up enemies as a more efficient way of killing them. How do you teach the player that they can do this? Well, if you're making Dead Space, you might write "cut off their limbs" in blood, then pop up a screen that says "shoot the limbs off of enemies for extra damage." Then provide an audio log that says,
"Listen, forget about shooting them in the body. You gotta cut off the limbs."
Then have another character call in and say,
"Shooting them in the body didn't seem to work. Go for the limbs. Dismember them. That should do the job."
And then pop up a screen that says "cut off limbs to kill quickly." At that point, the player might just start to catch on, or they might feel like they're being treated like a baby.
Like a baby. It's as if you're implying it's the only mechanic in the game. And did we forget about all the marketing reasons this was so heavily focused? Not to mention that once you're past the tutorial areas of the game, which is just about the area where you receive the last piece of guidance on this topic, they don't tell you again. You're on your own. I think it's a little disingenuous to not explain a little bit into why you think this is bad design, or whether or not Dead Space has this level of guidance in other mechanics for the game. For example, something I very much enjoy is Dead Space's use of the locator, which tells players exactly where to go. This is an inherent value for players who have trouble with getting lost, but for those who don't, they simply don't use it. The added bonus of such a mechanic allows players to correctly identify which directions are off the beaten track, and which ones are safe to explore without activating a boss fight or a cutscene. Basically, it's a very narrow view of Dead Space. I hope that you develop your point a little more.
4 years before this, Half-Life 2 managed to explain the exact same thing using just 2 moments and 0 words.
The exact same thing? I doubt it, but go ahead.
You notice that the doorway to the next section is blocked by this table and these blades. You pluck a blade out of the wall with your gravity gun, and at that moment, a zombie wanders into view. You instinctively hit the fire button, and wha-pow! You chop the sucker in half. And that's it. In about 10 seconds, Valve has taught you that saw blades are an effective weapon against zombies without making you read anything and without treating you like an infant.
Treating you like an infant. Let's ignore the fact that he says that as a catch-all criticism when there are games that exist solely for infants. But regardless of that, here's my issue. Equating the use of firing saw blades at enemies in Half-Life and the process of dismembering enemies in Dead Space have a massively different context. How about we open with Half-Life has a myriad of different weapons and the gravity gun is just one such method for dispatching enemies. While in Dead Space, every weapon is based on dismembering. It is a core principle that runs throughout the game and the series. This is an approach with all enemies, not an approach with individual weapons. If players fail to understand the basic premise, it would be like people not knowing that shooting zombies in the head is important for other zombie games. Furthermore, I don't think the scenario you're describing is as perfect as you say it is. Everything plays out logically and it tells you things without using words, sure. However, you don't get much in terms of freedom. This sequence forces you to pluck the blades from the wall. You can't move them in any other way. And having an enemy force spawn the moment you pick it up? Well, We could have just had a cutscene because my part in this charade is minimal. We could have had someone fighting off one of these creatures in a similar way, and by product showing the protagonist how it's done. We could have had an audio log of a character within the world explaining that this was the only way he could fight them off. We could have had a tooltip to get us to understand how it works quickly. It almost seems like it depends on the intentions of the genre or the developers, because this as a concept is not only very simple, but it's not hard to place into a game. Should the quality of the instruction solely be judged on whether or not it was detectable? If Dead Space wanted, they could have had a sequence where a monster tries to kill you and its limbs are chopped off, giving the player the information they need. Ah, but they do. Well, it looks like Visceral apparently weren't going to take the chance that players caught the messages. And who are you to say that they gave too much information? Do you think that no players in the world got the message at the last tooltip? Do you think the players still didn't have the message once they'd been given that thorough babying? And do you honestly think that people quit because the mean game took 5 seconds of their time to reaffirm the importance of dismemberment? I don't think so. What exactly makes this so much better anyway? You are forced to remove these things with a gravity gun. You have no choice. It's arguably a scripted moment, especially considering the spawn activation. And I find it very interesting that you failed to mention the extensive tutorial for the gravity gun earlier in the game, even though you show that scene later in your own video. Is this because it would then not be able to count as an invisible tutorial? I mean, you do specifically mention that this is a tutorial of how you can throw things at zombies and it will effectively kill them, but there are so many other methods of killing them at this point that this isn't even that necessary. And then if we directly compare that with dismemberment in Dead Space, not understanding that can basically higher the game by 2 difficulty standards. Players who never actually shot the legs off of things were going to have a hell of a lot more trouble, and Visceral knew that.
From the very beginning of the game, it's teaching you how to play without using obvious tutorials. When you're escaping Barney's back room, for example, you need to learn how to pick up and drop physics objects to advance. And when this chap says, "Pick up that can," the more defiant players will immediately learn how to throw objects.
But Mark, you do get a very straight-faced instruction for the stacking of the boxes. Literally a direct message from Barney.
Pile up some stuff to get through that window and keep going till you're in the plaza. I'll meet up with you later.
Not to mention that throwing the can is spelled out to you in a tooltip. You criticize Dead Space for both of these things, and yet I think that there's a place for both of them in many video games. What about this is a toolkit? Besides, the whole subtle design thing, it's in other games, man. But which ones? How about a comparison to, I don't know, Dead Space 2? You're provided a new ability called Kinesis, and a brief button prompt tooltip is provided to the player to let them know quickly and forthrightly how to use it. You have a resource around you of medical pins, and you will naturally pick them up as a test. Lo and behold, you are now under attack from multiple enemies. Let's try that new ability. Voila! The invisible tutorial as described by Mark Brown.
A little later on, you have to squeeze through a narrow gap and you end up knocking down some barrels that are in your way. They slide down a hill and get caught by these barnacles' tongues, teaching you that you can use objects to bypass this enemy.
I guess you're right. Except this is something that really bugged me because when I played the game, I pulled those barrels out and continued as I had been throughout the game, shooting the barnacles. Whoops, I guess that's my fault, and Valve chose not to have a safety net for those who don't pay enough attention. Or don't explore the world thoroughly enough, or don't explore the world the way that they want them to. And you know what? That's their prerogative. It doesn't make them right or wrong, better or worse.
Like the barnacle, almost all the enemies in the game are first shown to you in a safe environment. The first zombie you see is behind a fence, so you can see that it's able to throw objects, but you don't actually get hit.
First of all, Mark, that isn't the first zombie you encounter. Quick look into someone else playing the game, I found that there were at least 2 before it. Secondly, these zombies need to be triggered by you entering their radius. In order to do what you're saying is natural, you have to move out from the protective gratings to trigger the radius. If you want to stop the zombie from hitting you with an object, you'll need the knowledge that they are even able to do that in the first place, and that can result in you being hit. However, that is unless you manipulate the footage to the best of your ability and commentate that that's how things go down, I guess no one's going to be the wiser. Except that we can see you move behind the fence after you've alerted the enemy. Stuff like this always bothers me because there's still plenty to discuss about how well this sequence is put together. But now we have to start getting very superlative in description and ignore anything that could possibly be happening in the scenario that doesn't match the narrative at hand. And that narrative currently is Half-Life 2 is the best. I mean, it's not like this is new to me. I dismantled the whole Soma isn't scary bullshit from Joseph, and I've tackled everyone saying that Resident Evil 7 is fantastic. I say keep them coming. And so a large portion of the video is literally cherry-picking more examples of invisible tutorials, which he defines as guidance without traditional hints, despite the fact that we already acknowledge that tooltips are used in this game, and much of the tutorials he's referencing are used in several games. Take this one.
Other puzzles hint at their solution through the world design. This one, which involves using a grenade to fling yourself up to this balcony, has a big box of grenades in the corner, a wire that runs up to a green button, a scorch mark under the flap, and even a dead body up in the rafters.
So interestingly enough, I recently played Wolfenstein, you know, the new one, and this very same design popped up in that. The idea that you're in a confined space with an infinite resource of a particular weapon and the room itself is telling you that something needs to be done. In Wolfenstein, it was throwing the grenade at the active turret, and then that blew a hole in the floor that allowed you to continue. Another example of that is, I don't know, Dead Space, where you're given infinite stasis refills and you're unable to pass a door unless it slows down. This occurs about several meters after the last piece of footage that Mark Brown showed from Dead Space. These principles are not something that Half-Life alone has, nor are they something it started, since it's a basic understanding of logic. The thing is in the way. This thing beats that thing. This thing is temporarily infinite.
And in the modern era, games like Resident Evil 4 and Super Mario Galaxy have done a good job of teaching players in an organic, understated way. But it's still uncommon, and today's games far too frequently fall back on the bog-standard teaching mechanics that either break the flow of gameplay or completely patronise the player.
Fuck off. You do not know this to be true, because you spent all of 1 second to criticize each of these games. How about we don't do that? How about we look at his claims, because my god am I a long-form analyst when it comes to video games, and as you can imagine, spending less than 1 second on a point is like drinking liquid cancer to me. Oh, and if anyone had a pretense of me behaving with some kind of professionalism in my videos, no. So he says Resident Evil 4 and Super Mario Galaxy are good for this. I would say you should discount Nintendo because they cookie-cut their games for kids every time. To say that they only employ this invisible tutorial would be very inaccurate. They shove tooltips up your ass and give you plenty of characters in-game that tell you how to operate. So saying that Super Mario Galaxy is not a game that patronizes you is just wrong, but I would accept the argument that it is by design because it's for kids, and it does not take away from the enjoyment of the game itself. I guess this is me saying that he could have had Super Mario Galaxy in the opening instead of Dead Space, and put Dead Space here instead of Super Mario Galaxy, and it wouldn't have changed anything. So next up is Deus Ex Human Revolution. The screenshot we get is of the game telling Mark that he shouldn't get too close to a guard to not alert them. The issue I have is by looking at the screenshot is something that he is able to scroll through or back out from, meaning it's optional to display. Well, is it? What is the context for this? Who fucking knows, the video's only 6.5 minutes long. Next up we have Dishonored. Mark is showing us a moment where you are sneaking up on an enemy and the game says, new objective, find the explosive, in the corner. Which is fine in terms of guidance. I would honestly say that the majority of games have this. Even Resident Evil 7, a game that removed its HUD as much as possible in aid of immersion, and that still has that. But then as Mark moves through, it looks like the game provides a tooltip. Damn it. All that immersion broken now because of this. Oh wait. Let's at least read it. Oh, how patronizing. It's telling me that I can either choose to kill or knock out an enemy. Boring. Let me play my game. Oh, it's also telling me that the difference between that choice is significant. If you don't choose to kill people, then you will reap rewards such as less rats, fewer and less significant reactions from the public, and the final outcome is not as dark. Well, that's 5 pieces of information regarding a mechanic you're about to perform. And what? They're supposed to teach you all of that in the way that Half-Life does. Sorry for the terrible Mark Brown impression there, but I had to. Now, how does one teach those systems without a traditional form of information? It would change the game itself. Dishonored is fast-paced, Dishonored is not Half-Life 2, though I appreciate the 3 seconds it received for criticism in your video. Assassin's Creed, while he utters the phrase, breaking the flow of the game. It is literally the tutorial, and there is a tooltip on how to move, similar to the tooltip he displayed in his own video in aid of saying Half-Life is genius. Fucking hell, mate. In what universe does that break the flow? Far Cry, while saying it can patronize the player. So what is the information we have on screen? To get the bait, hold square to skin any animal. Open the weapon wheel by holding L1 and select the bait with R. Throw bait with R1 to lure predators to the area. I'm sorry, is this patronizing? Did I miss something? Does everyone just know how to collect and use bait in Far Cry? Why would you know how to do this, and how did you teach a player naturally without conventional tooltips? This is a specific mechanic unique to this game. You can't just not tell the player how it's done. Is context not a word to you?
Yes, some games may be too complicated or open-ended to copy Valve's solution, and not every developer has the luxury to spend years on playtesting.
Did I catch that correctly? You understand that there is some context. Your two examples were that games can be too open-ended or that there are time constraints. That's wonderful, but then you said this.
I hope that more developers are influenced by the way Valve teaches its players and not just its physics puzzles, its dystopian future, and those damn tram ride intros.
They are. Play any game in relation to physics engines or puzzles. There'll be clear influences. You know, this video may have been relevant about 13 years before when the game was actually being released, but putting this out in 2015 is fucking bizarre, not to mention the blatant misunderstanding of tutorials and how they fit into genres, and what their purpose even is in many games. I would have been more forgiving on his examples, but I haven't properly played Dishonored, Deus Ex, or even a single Far Cry except number 2. I haven't played any Assassin's Creed since the first one. Despite that, I put a far better defense in terms of design than he did. I also would have been more forgiving if he had qualified anything or gave more extended examples. But this is Game Maker's Toolkit, and nuance is as obstructive as research. Just a low-quality video derived from one narrow viewpoint which adds nothing to game design discussions. Because it forces people like me to make videos like this, correcting the record. In conclusion on Mark Brown, I suggest you guys go check him out. You may like his videos, he has a nice voice and is on point in one or two of his pieces. Regardless of that, we will return to his content throughout these vivisections, and it won't be pretty. Anyway, next up is Teaching Game Mechanics Well, Guidance versus Handholding, Design Doc. So naturally by that title, it seems to be that handholding and guidance are two opposites, even though handholding is a form of guidance, but whatever.
Every designer eventually has to solve the same problem. How do you efficiently teach players how to play your game? Every designer solves this problem a little differently.
So far so good, I like it.
A game that plays itself may as well be a movie, but a game that just immediately throws you into the deep end without easing you into it can be overwhelming or frustrating.
I agree here, but I feel like that's obvious. We'd have to delve a little deeper before we can conclude anything.
Sometimes without solid guidance, we become lost.
Are you saying that Metroid doesn't give you enough information on where to go?
But for the designers that can thread the needle, their works can become instant classics. Those fantastic pick-up-and-play experiences that are celebrated as some of the best that the industry has to offer.
But Super Meat Boy is an intrinsically simple game. That's not really fair to have it as a counterexample to Metroid. What's going on here?
These games often teach players new mechanics not through text, but through what's called the isolation principle of game design.
No, we did this already, I'm sorry. We're gonna have to skip his description of this, not to mention skipping the part where it isn't applicable to video games as a whole, but whatever.
Some genres naturally make it harder to use effectively. Turn-based strategy games and RPGs usually have very complex and abstract mechanics, which makes it tougher to use. A game like Civilization, for example, might need to fall back on more basic teaching techniques, like text-heavy instructions to teach players how to play.
I'm sorry, but what? You consider it a basic technique to carefully translate into a series of concise instructions how to operate a massive game with thousands of variables.
It's tough to get statistical mechanics, like happiness or science, across to the player without just directly explaining it.
If only there was some visible difference between Civ and Mario that could explain this change in design methodology.
You can also completely screw up using the isolation principle if you feed mechanics to the player too slowly and hold back the interesting parts for too long.
How the fuck is Monster Hunter an example of this? I'm assuming that's Monster Hunter. You should be qualifying all of this, you can't just say it. It's not fair at all. All these games taking hits so that you can sound very well versed isn't really worth it, dude. Okay, so he then takes 5 minutes to explain that Final Fantasy XIII doesn't give you full freedom of control until 20 hours in, which is a bad form of tutorial or hand-holding. While I'm gonna say I have no idea since I haven't played it, I will say yes, if your tutorial lasts 20 hours, there is something clearly fucking wrong.
The bosses in the Dark Souls series are rarely about figuring out exactly how to hurt them and more about learning their patterns, properly timing your attacks and positioning yourself. The difference is in the player's execution. Most Zelda bosses are treated more like puzzles than actual battles. Attacks are easy to dodge and rarely do much damage. So it's less about execution and recognizing patterns, and more about solving the puzzle of getting to the boss's weakness.
You literally just described recognizing patterns twice without realizing it. You said that Dark Souls is a matter of recognizing patterns and then finding opportunities to deal damage, while Zelda is about finding the weak spot and exploiting it when able. Basically, learning the pattern and hitting the enemy. Zelda is understandably more straightforward because it is a game designed for children, to be enjoyed by all ages, so you're basically just wrong.
The problem is that the solutions are more or less screaming at you the moment you see the boss. How many times is the weakness going to be a giant glowing eyeball? Or a giant glowing whatever this is?
The boss is often about how to exploit the weak spot, not where the weak spot is. You know, learn the pattern, solve the puzzle, etc.
Having a consistent visual design is usually a good thing, but having an almost identical solution to the "how do I kill this boss?" question can get dull.
You literally just showed me a completely different way of dispatching a boss than all the ones you've shown so far, while saying that dispatching bosses is the same way every time, and it gets dull. I'm so lost right now. Please help.
The boss of the Woodfall Temple is in a room filled with these special flower launch pads, which the player can use with Deku Link to fly and drop bombs below. Now up to this point, the player has spent several hours using Link's Deku form, so the player is drawn towards these flowers. In the boss's introductory cutscene, we are shown a giant eyeball at the top of his head.
Okay, that sounds like some really solid design, especially for a first boss. You have the weak spot shown, a clear taught method to get to it, and it's been presented and experienced throughout the game previously. And I imagine you hit him for the golden 3 times and boom, first boss completed, right?
The game has more or less already told the player exactly how to beat the boss before the fight has even started. When the player flies with the Deku form, the boss literally just stands there dumbfounded and lets you drop bombs on him to stun him. There is no challenge or thought really required here.
Except all of the thought you just had and laid out for us in terms of design, not to mention the references to previous levels within the game, but yeah, no real thought at all.
It would be a much more interesting fight if, for example, a boss knew about the dungeon item and tried to keep you from using it, or guarded against it in some way. Just something to make the player think a bit harder about what they're able to do.
Oh, you mean like Adolwa does? When you try and use the launch pad, he tries to stop you by swiping at you with his sword? Yep.
So, providing guidance requires a delicate touch. Give too little information and the player can become totally lost. Flood the player with information or hold the player's hand too much, and it takes away the satisfaction of discovering a game's complexity. The designers who figure out how to strike that balance can make a great game just that much better.
That's literally what you said at the beginning. What did we even learn? Oh. Well then. Okay. Thank God people make these videos just over 10 minutes. My brain couldn't take too much discussion on this topic, you know? It's just so much to take in. Okay, so I couldn't find much else on this topic in terms of specific videos, and as I said, Mark's video is what spurred me to make my video. I think we just need to be more honest about these subjects. If we were to analyze and break down a tutorial in a game, we could define perhaps what would be good and bad within the game itself, but the caveat would be that certain players will and will not react to the information being translated to them on screen, and that would cause many issues. So what can we say about guidance in general then? Well, it is important. It comes in many shapes and sizes, some of it is obtrusive and some of it is fantastic. But if you want actual reasons for individual games being good or bad in these respects, then you have to get specific, you have to consider context, because not everything should just be like Half-Life 2. And I think people of this genre, the whole game analysis people, they're falling into that trap because, well, specifically Mark Brown is forced to make regular 10-minute videos discussing things in a very concise and restricted manner. People like Joseph Anderson, they have other issues. And that about wraps up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Vivisection has a bunch of plans for the future, and it would hopefully be something of a regular, sort of, you know, multiple times per year sort of series, if I could pull it off. Subjects are going to be all over the place, and I imagine I wouldn't mind taking a request here or there. I want to remind everybody that I have set up a Patreon, and if you would like to support me through that, I would massively appreciate it, as it may lead to this becoming a full-time gig. Regardless, thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.